In the developing world, I don't think you can really meaningfully function as a citizen without a smartphone. Software is no longer optional.
It's important that that feedback is taken on and we learn from it, right? With design, one thing I say is you're never going to get it right the first time.
Because it was me, the executive in charge of the online store, and Steve. So it's like three of us in a big conference room. Steve just looks at me. There's no way you're doing that to my store.
The expectation has shifted, I guess, from when you were first involved to today. It's important to try and get to that point where you can actually get yourself in the user or the customer's shoes. In my perspective, well, that's not going to work. Why are we doing that?
These organizations collectively ship a lot of junk. There's millions of people on the other side of the glass that are suffering because you couldn't make a good decision.
Bob Baxley is a UX designer, leader, and executive with over 30 years in Silicon Valley, having held key roles at Apple, where he worked directly with Steve Jobs, Pinterest, Yahoo, and more. As a designer, author, and speaker, Bob is known for his expertise in building world-class design organizations and coaching emerging leaders on effective collaboration and talent development. Join us for our conversation with Bob Baxley.
Well, welcome to the podcast, Bob. It's great to have you on. I've been looking forward to this chat, been following your work for quite a while in your career, so it's great to have you on.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks for having me, Julian. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Hope things are going well in Perth today. Gonna have some fun. Super hot here in Silicon Valley, which is a little unexpected for October, but we're making the best of it. So.
Awesome. Good. Well, for those that may not be as familiar with your work and your career, obviously you've worked at a lot of places, including Apple, and done a lot of work there. But give us a bit of background about your career and what you've done to date.
Oh, wow. There's a long story and there's a short story. If we just go with the short story, it sort of starts like this. I am at a slightly different generation than probably most of your listeners, and I started in software design in 1990, moving to Silicon Valley from Dallas, Texas, to work for a company called Claris, which at the time was a wholly owned software subsidiary of Apple. I was there for a while and worked on a variety of products like Mac Project, Mac Draw, Claris Works, Claris Resolve, some other products. Then sort of took some time and was consulting in and around Silicon Valley, and eventually joined a handful of startups around the .com boom. Ended up at Yahoo in the early 2000s and went to Apple, as you mentioned, in about 2006. Joined Apple about 9 months before the phone was announced. So when I joined, the hot product was the iPod Nano, the first iPod to feature flash RAM instead of a mechanical hard drive. And then I was privileged to lead the design team for the Apple online store for 6 years. So if anybody ever went to apple.com and configured like a $20,000 Mac Pro, that was the site that we worked on. In addition to the website, we also did the Apple Store app, including some of the really cool features that you could use inside Apple Retail. One of which is self-pay inside Apple Retail, which still feels amazingly like stealing, even though it's not. And then I actually spent a couple of years before I left Apple. I spent 2 years on the retail side, working on the corporate side of retail, designing some of the tools that they use inside the stores. After that, I had the privilege to go lead design at Pinterest for a little while. And then after Pinterest, sort of hung out for a few more years, and then ended up until recently working at a company called ThoughtSpot, which is a data analytics enterprise software program here in Silicon Valley. It competes with the likes of Tableau and Microsoft Power BI. I was there for about 4 years and then left just a few months ago. So yeah, add it all up together, and I've been designing software for a little over 34 years now.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, incredible. And obviously worked on some amazing projects across that time, and obviously had a lot of insight as well. And that's what I want to jump into today a bit more and get a bit more of an understanding, just discuss some concepts, some ideas from your perspective as well. I know one of them is you look at kind of software and technologies, a new form of media. And I know that's one of the things that you discuss as well. So do you mind unpacking that a little bit more? I know you mentioned on some of our discussions that, it's a bit of an art form, etc., but it is that new form of media. What do you say to that?
Yeah, well, that idea came up when I was, after I left Pinterest, and I spent a few years kind of wandering around Silicon Valley, kind of wondering what had happened to the tech industry. And this was around 2016, when there was a lot of questions about the influence the tech industry was having on mental health and on, domestic politics around the world, et cetera. And in the context of that questioning, I ended up listening to a podcast about the history of Silicon Valley, which helped me kind of reconnect to the counterculture hippie roots of Silicon Valley, which I think is really lost today. But Silicon Valley came of age in the late 1960s during the middle of the counterculture hippie revolution, which in the United States was largely based here in San Francisco. And so there's a terrific book by Fred Turner, I believe is the author's name, and the book is called From Counterculture to Cyberculture. And mostly what he's doing is he's tracing the legacy of Stuart Brand, and again, sort of that hippie ethos in Silicon Valley. And in that book, he's got this great line, which is, if you have to ask yourself why it was that personal computing was invented in the San Francisco Bay Area in Silicon Valley in the late 1960s, when at the time, every tech company in the country was based on the East Coast. And the answer is that there was a small group of people in and around Stanford University, largely at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, who saw software as a new form of media on par with movies, music, and books. And when I heard that, it just went straight to my heart, honestly, and I realized, that was sort of the thing that had been lost for me. And I had gotten trapped in this model of technology and software as a tool. And, a tool that kind of measures people and reduces everything to clicks and metrics and is very much kind of a counting machine kind of mechanism. And I remembered I fell in love with computing because computing is just this modern miracle of life. I mean, we're so lucky to get to use computing. It's something we just take for granted. But what you and I are doing right now would blow the minds of anybody living in 1995, much less 1795, right? It's just absolutely phenomenal. And so for me, software it's not art, it's not personal expression, it's I don't mean it in that way, but it's so much more than just a tool. And so, you'll see me on LinkedIn. I was just posting actually half an hour ago, sort of challenging this idea that software design is science and can all be measured. And, I don't even think that that's the right way to approach it. It's so much more than that. And so I'm not saying that there's not ways to measure the efficacy and there's not ways to think about your software tool as a business, and you would manage your business with a lot of metrics and drive that way as well. But there's something much more powerful about software. I would contend that software is the most influential cultural artifact being produced in the world today. It's in fact the most important cultural artifact probably ever produced. There's absolutely no doubt that the cultural impact of software today absolutely dwarfs anything coming out of the movie industry, the music industry, the sports industry, or the book industry. The impact of Facebook and Google, Airbnb, the impact of those products on culture dwarfs anything that's happened since, I don't know, since the Beatles or something, right?
Yeah.
And I think when we get into this mentality of measurements and metrics and try to treat it like it's an engineering task instead of a psychological, human, emotional endeavor, I think we really dehumanize it, and we leave a lot of opportunity on the floor, opportunity to make people's lives better, and to connect with one another through these tools.
Yeah. No, I think it's very, very interesting, and I think it's an interesting perspective and a good way to look at it. I think I just want to jump into a bit more around what actually I suppose, sparked your interest in it. I suppose software overall, and really got your interest in it. You've been in it for a long time. I know for myself, as part of it was where I first was introduced to it. And again, a different generation, but it was really when computers were first coming into learning, right? Coming into curriculum, where they were first brought into schools. It was becoming, I guess, more mainstream, I guess. And I remember obviously us having computer classes, working on the computers and playing Mario, right? Early version of Mario on the computers. And I was from there, it was fascinating of there's just so much you can do with this, right? It was incredible at the time. And then obviously as phones made their way out and all of that, it just accelerated faster and faster. But I'd love to hear your, what got you into it, what sparked your interest?
Well, I think it's a similar story. I the first computer I saw, I was 11 years old. I was in Dallas. It would have been around, 1976? I might have been about 13. And a friend of mine's father worked at Texas Instruments, a semiconductor company there in Dallas. And my friend, his name was Glenn Wilkinson. His father, Tom, had actually worked on the Apollo program. He designed some of the mechanics of the Saturn V rocket. And Tom and Glenn, so Tom's like a super nerd, and they had bought a Heathkit computer, which was one of the very original personal computers you could buy, and you assembled it at home. And if I recall, it had the 8088, the original Intel processor and stuff. And so I do vividly remember going into Glenn's bedroom. And Glenn was a couple of years older than me, and he was tolerant of me at the time. And at the end of his bedroom, which was kind of carved out of some part of their garage, there was a piano bench. And on the piano bench was this screen-looking thing that looked kind of like a TV. You know, it looked kind of like this weird black and white TV that had letters on it. And then there was this big metal box with some keypads on it, like numeric keypads. And then he had this keyboard, which looked like something that had been taken out of a typewriter, but it had a cable on it, you know. And these were shapes and devices that I had never seen before in my life. And Glenn was explaining to me that it was a computer. And he started typing some things on the keyboard and letters changed on the screen. And that alone was pretty novel because in 1974, 75, 76, you couldn't really change the pictures on your TV. You could change channels, but you couldn't really change what was happening on the TV. And so the fact that he was changing the TV was novel, but it didn't blow me away. And he would type a letter and it would show up on the screen, and that all sort of made sense to me. But then he typed a couple of words, and then the screen went bonkers, right? And like all this stuff came out. In retrospect, what had happened was he had triggered a basic program, and the basic program was outputting, you know, whatever the program was supposed to do. But, you know, suddenly I think that's when my little brain just went like, crap, like what was that? Like I had never seen that before. You know, that was just otherworldly magical. And obviously it had a really big impact on me. A few years later, much like you, the school I was attending got an early computer, and we got a Wang computer, which had a astounding 4K of RAM and used a cassette drive to store programs. Yeah. And I learned to program in BASIC. And I think my little ADHD brain just like really took to programming. And there was something kind of about the philosophy and structure of programming that brought me in. And then I left that school, and the school that I went to didn't have personal computers. We had time-sharing computers, and I never got into it. And at that point, my parents didn't have enough money to buy me a computer. But it turns out that by the time I got to high school, I sort of realized I was a maker. And I suspect most of your listeners kind of know that in their heart as well. And I'm sure that's true of you as well. You kind of know you're a maker. And so in high school, I dabbled in music and photography. When I went to college, I studied film, actually. I went to music school briefly after college. And I think, and then after that, I ended up starting a graphic design studio. You know, at the time, it seemed all random, right? And I was, you know, obviously I was in my early 20s at the time. At the time, I couldn't really understand what was going on. But then what happened is then I got a job with Claris, and I started designing software, and suddenly all the stars aligned for me. And when I look back at it, what I realized is from the time I was in high school, if not earlier, I knew in my heart I was a maker. And then I was just sort of sequencing through all these different mediums, through photography, through graphic design, through film, through music. And then finally I found software, and software is where it all came together for me. And that's how I combined sort of the analytical side that was kind of drawn to some of the programming, the system side that was drawn to some of the psychology side, so the graphic design side, you know, just a lot of different pieces of the puzzle came together for me that made my, you know, the types of things that my brain wants to create tend to be software ideas. And so I look at it. Yeah, I'm sure you do, you know? Yeah. And look, I think you just kind of fall in love with your medium. And so when people say, you know, what keeps you going? It's like, well, I don't know. You might as well ask a novelist why they're still writing another book, you know, or ask Steven Spielberg why he's going to make another movie. It's sort of, you know, what you go do. You know, the industry's changed a lot, and making software is a big, complicated effort now. And it's not, you know, it's not the easy days where you can make something at scale with a small group of people. At least that doesn't seem to happen very often now. But, you know, certainly I have all my little side projects and personal websites, and, you know, I'm still tinkering with lots of different things, again, just because I absolutely love the medium.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And I think a big part of that is just wanting to create, right? And like how the expectation has shifted, I guess, from when you were first involved to today, of like things that, for example, we go back to, you know, early 2000s and, you know, online banking, you know, things like that there, right? were very primitive, essentially. Nowadays, there's banks that are falling behind. I'm not trying to focus specifically on banks, but just an easy example. But that are falling behind because the expectation, once it's been around for 6 months, 12 months, it's suddenly just everyone's expected to do what someone else has done, right? The bar just keeps moving higher and higher and higher. I know you mentioned like back in 1795, like would have blown the minds to even for us to have this conversation as we're on completely opposite ends of the globe, basically, right? Where we're having this conversation in real time and connecting. And I think that's what I want to get into a bit more from my perspective. I've had a much shorter view of that, if that makes any sense, right? Like where more of where I was working, phones were kind of the normal, right? When it started to get into that and things like that, it was that you just get an app and do this. But even since, from my perspective, since that was the case to where we are today, there's been a monumental shift, let alone back from 30 years, 40 years ago. And so, what do you think? I suppose just about that evolution of design and that expectation of those experiences over that time, and then just really how you've seen that evolve, I guess.
Yeah, so when I think about the evolution of software design, I track it, not surprisingly, to the history of film. I have a degree in history and a degree in film, so it's not surprising I would kind of relate things to the history of film. It's true that there were a lot of people making software before 2008. And 2008 is the year that Apple introduced the App Store, right? So the phone comes out in 2007. The App Store comes out in 2008. 2008 is the year that Barack Obama won the nomination for the Democratic nomination for the presidential election. So most people in the United States, they can still remember, Obama's first term. And it doesn't feel that far away. But that's when the App Store came out. It's just not that far away. Was that 16 years now? And so I think of the App Store as sort of this bright line in the history of software, whereas before the App Store, people were making software, but a typical user was only using software mostly at work, and they were having maybe a few dozen, a few hundred at most interactions during the day. And so there was a lot of friction in using software that people would sort of tolerate. And again, by the time the App Store comes out, I'd been designing software for 18 years. So I've been at it for a while. So I did a lot of work before the App Store. But let's be honest, that the work before the smartphones and the App Store, it's sort of like silent movies, right? There's a lot of great silent movies. I mean, all the Buster Keaton stuff, all the Charlie Chaplin stuff, those are all silent movies. But that's not really what we talk about when we talk about movies. What shifted in the movie industry is the advent of synchronized sound, which came out with the movie The Jazz Singer, which I can't remember if it was like 1932 or 1928, but it's in that range. And then shortly after that, you get color movies with The Wizard of Oz, which I think is 1934, 1936, somewhere in that range. And so cinema undergoes this massive transition when you pick up synchronized sound and color, and then you kind of get the golden era of movies after that. And that's how I think about the App Store. It's kind of this bright dividing line. And once you get the App Store and you get smartphones in people's hands, suddenly they're having hundreds to thousands of interactions a day, and you have ubiquitous computing. And we call it the phone, but it's not a phone. It's a computer. It's a computer that's in your pocket. I think most of us would probably happily delete the phone app if we could. Like I could go for a long time without ever using my iPhone as a phone. In fact, I sort of avoid it. So I think what really happened is the smartphone became the primary way that we're interacting with software, becomes ubiquitous and frequent in people's lives. And then as time has moved on, it's basically become the remote control and the interface to every IT system of every meaningful bureaucracy in the world. So at least in the developing world, I don't think you can really meaningfully function as a citizen without a smartphone. You'd be very challenged to make hotel reservations, to pay your bills, to check in at an airport, to navigate a new city, to hail a cab. There's a lot of just essential functioning inside the modern world that require, pay for things that requires a smartphone. And it's true in a lot of the developing world as well. You go to India, I don't know, you talk about what we mean by developing, but you go to India or China, it's going to be nearly impossible to exist in those societies without a smartphone. And so I think the main thing that's changed is that software is no longer optional. And because of that, I think now we as UI designers, in fact, we as a tech industry now have a moral obligation to make software that's meaningful and useful and accessible and approachable, because people are depending on us in a way that they weren't, 20 years ago. And so when I see poorly designed software, things that are simply ugly, is kind of one point, stuff that doesn't make sense. And then there's things that just flat out don't work well, I guess. And there's things that are misleading. If you're on the spectrum with that stuff, like, I think that's a moral failing of those companies, that they're delivering those kinds of products, because people have to use them.
Yeah. And it obviously becomes, that's around in the B2C space, I guess, and when not even B2C, like when you're talking, especially when you've got essential services and that kind of thing, they even become more critical, right? Like where, for example, a medical or a health application versus something that is a streaming, is two very different things. But the idea should still be the same. It's like, what are we doing to provide? Obviously, with the health side of things, there's going to be more emphasis on making sure it's reliable and everything else, which I totally understand. It's not necessarily, it's more functional, whereas maybe the streaming thing's got some side around more of it, the branding and also how it actually looks, the UI and that kind of thing as well. But the idea still the core should remain the same. What is the best experience, right? What is the best experience for what we're trying to achieve here?
Well, I'll just say, look, when lives are at stake, typically government regulations involved. So that's
absolutely.
That's kind of, you're kind of in a different world there. But even in stuff like streaming services, kind of 2 points I'll make. One is, even in, we might think as entertainment services, there's still people on the other side of the glass. We all sit here and we design software and we work in these engineering organizations kind of by ourselves, very abstracted from everything. But, the things that I worked on at Apple, or that people at Amazon or Google work on, those things are impacting the lives of billions of people a day. And every little ounce of friction or lack of clarity or imprecision in those experiences gets amplified and causes an enormous amount of human emotional dissonance. And I don't think people sitting by themselves designing software take that seriously enough. And I don't just mean the designers, I mean the entire organization. These organizations collectively ship a lot of junk. Because they think, we'll just run an experiment and see what happens. What's happening? There's millions of people on the other side of the glass that are suffering because you couldn't make a good decision. That's what's happening. Now, you're abstracted from them, so you don't think about it, but there's a cost there. The other point I'll make is this idea of B2B versus B2C. Like, the idea that there's enterprise software that doesn't matter as much. Like, I don't buy that at all. Like, people are people,
100% agree.
Whether they are functioning as employees or not. And that was one of the things that really got drilled into me, and that I really took away from my experience working in Apple retail. The software that we developed for the specialists in the store, and there's not that many specialists. I mean, there's a few hundred stores, so you're not talking about cast of thousands, or not cast of millions, but there's a few thousand people working in Apple retail, and I had an obligation to create something that assisted them and did not demand much of their attention, and they were people first and employees second. And I think that gets lost at a lot of enterprise software companies.
Yeah, I totally agree, 100%. It doesn't matter who you're designing for, but who is it, and what is the best experience? What are we trying to achieve here, and how do we do that as well as we can? And it sounds simple, right? But that is so overlooked. And I think for me, at least from my perspective and what the projects that we work on, this isn't necessarily, we work more in that enterprise space, if that makes sense, in the B2B space, not with applications, obviously, that are at the scale of where Apple App Store and that kind of thing, where they're getting delivered to such a great amount of people. But even so, at that scale that we are working with, it doesn't matter. There's still people that are using it, and there's still inefficiencies. There's still decisions that are being made that are getting made by executives or designers or whoever it is that are completely ill-informed. And I guess a lot of it, from what we do and what we've seen as well, is that they don't truly understand, or the project is missing actually the user research or what we're trying to genuinely create, right? And I'm not sitting around talking about you doing useless research in these projects for months and months that don't bring any fruit, essentially. But do we truly understand, right, what we're trying to create, who we're trying to create it for, and what they want to achieve? Because if we did, all of our decisions would come back to that. And does it align with that, or does it not? And if it doesn't, why are we doing it?
Yeah, totally.
What are some of the, on that specific thing around, I'll just dive in a bit deeper, where you obviously were working on some of the enterprise stuff for Apple. Like, what are some of the key things that you saw, I suppose, the key things to success from your perspective in designing those things, and then any failures or anything that you feel that they're often overlooked? And I think one of them you touched on there was the fact that there is no difference between B2B or B2C or enterprise, whatever else. It is just we're designing for humans. But what would you say on that?
Well, so yeah, there's a lot of different stories that I could go with. So, Apple is a unique design environment because Apple competes on design. So, I mean, more so than almost any other company in the world, Apple competes on design. And so every individual in the company is constantly asking, is this the best we can do? And Apple very much believes that that Apple won't put a product in market unless it's the best that they can think of at the time, right? They don't prematurely go into market, which is very different from how any other company works. And it's very different from the way that a software startup can work, because a startup's got to generate revenue in a different way. So there's a lot of different business mechanics at play here. If we just focus on Apple, I mean, look, there was the thing of, you stayed in the room and you beat up on the ideas as long as and hard as you could, and you showed them to the executives until nobody could think of any way to make them better. The ultimate compliment you would get at Apple is not, this is great. What you would get is, yeah, I can't really think about how to make it better. Like that was, everybody was constantly, how do I make it better? And, I had designers and other jobs constantly bringing me work, and they're like, well, what do you think of this? And I just look at them as like, well, what do you think of it? Are there changes you would want to make? And they're like, yeah, I'd do this. And it's, it's like, well, if there's changes you want to make, go make those changes and then bring me your best work,
Yeah.
And so, again, Apple's culturally different from that. Probably one of the most powerful, a little bit to your question, probably the most powerful experience I had at Apple Retail is I was doing kind of ethnography, observational research in the stores, watching how specialists interacted with customers. And there was one particular specialist who had early onset Parkinson's. And he was in the Palo Alto store. And he wasn't that, he's probably in his mid 40s or something, but he had a slight shake. And the software that they used for the handheld point of sale system, when you go to Apple Retail, you pay in the store. So, that ran at the time that ran on an iPod Touch. Now it runs on an iPhone, but, screens of limited size and stuff. And the software that they were using in the store had been developed by Apple's internal IT team, and it wasn't particularly thoughtfully designed. And so I watched this guy with a slight tremor in his hand try to navigate the software, and it's hard for him. It's like physically demanding for him. And when I watched that, I realized, when I redesigned this product, which I did, I need to make it for that guy. I need to make it as easy as possible for that guy. And so the design I came up with was what I called the four corners design. And if you thought about the iPhone as, like whatever, kind of this shape, if I can get the focus to work. So like one corner was the menu and one corner was help. And then one corner was okay, go forward. And the other corner was cancel, go back. And these were big giant buttons and these were big giant tap targets. And all the content happened in the middle. And every screen was like that. Every single screen in the app followed that template. And what it meant was that for him, he had big giant tap targets, and all he had to do was hit these corners of the screen. What it meant for everybody else is they could navigate the product blindfolded, like they just knew where the OK button was, right? And it was one of those things. Like, again, working in retail, you could go and you could see people using the software, and it created an empathy that really drove how I thought about the problem. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges with software today is that people have kind of foregone traditional usability testing. And I've never been a big fan of usability testing as validation, but actually watching how normal people, what I call mere mortals, watching mere mortals use software is incredibly educational, because you realize that they don't process software the way you and I do, because we're tech superheroes. Like, we live and breathe this crap, but most people don't, because most people are normal. Right. And so when you go and you watch normal people use software, you just get a different sense for them, and you want to create something that they can use that makes sense and that is enjoyable by them. And because we've gone mostly to A/B testing and looking at those kinds of metrics, we've really gotten even more abstracted from our audience. And software design by far is the most distant medium from the audience. If you were a musician, you would go perform in concert, or at a minimum, you would go see somebody else perform in concert. If you're a filmmaker, you can go watch people watch your movie, or at least watch people watch other movies. Comedy, you can see stuff. Literature, you can do book. Like every other medium, you can go and you can watch an audience in real time. And weirdly, software, you can't. So in my, over the course of my career, I've been lucky to work on things that have probably been used by 1 billion people, like 1 billion people. And yet I have never, ever seen anyone use something I've created in real time in a non, artificial environment. I mean, people will tell me that they use something that I worked on, but I've never actually seen it.
Yeah.
And so I have to go out of my way, and I encourage your listeners too to just go to your way. You have to go to your way to kind of just be like this weird observational scientist. And when you're walking around in public spaces, kind of lean over people's shoulders and try to watch what they're doing. If you have kids that are at home that have teenage friends or something, you kind of, I always used to talk to my kids' friends, much to my kids' annoyance. I would talk to their friends and try to find out what apps they had on their phone and get them to show me cool stuff on their phone. And you learn a lot. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think I agree. It is I wouldn't say necessarily complicated, but it is a big topic. Is the fact that overall, I think not enough research, and what I would add on to that as well was what you said is learning is done within the space of knowing, even especially in our kind of space when we work with probably more traditional industries and do stuff like that. There is that as a designer or someone working on the product, and I would put this wider than just designers, but it is your obligation, right, to actually understand how things work within. Now you can't, you haven't had 30 years experience, but you have to do what you can to understand how things work, how things go. As you said, observe as best we can and learn from that and go, okay, yes, I do get that things probably don't work the way I think they do, essentially, or the way I would do them. It's a bit different to that, and then actually bringing that into your workflow, because I agree with that feedback and being involved. I know you do it in your roles previously. You did a lot of kind of design critique or reviews, etc., and you were involved in a lot of that. But when people would come to you, there would be things you'd be able to point out straight away that you're like, bang, like this here, this needs to be improved. Have we thought about this? Have we gone away and have we done this? And I think one of the ones was Steve Jobs. This was when he was giving you feedback. I think you presented to him 4 times, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
But I wanted to touch off on the feedback side of things, because I know you mentioned that he was pretty blunt with his feedback, pretty straight to the point, and saw things pretty quickly as to say, well, that's not going to work, right? And to me, it's a great way of giving feedback. I'm not saying it's not, might not offend people or anything else, but like, it's just like straight away seeing something going, that's not going to work, right? Like, it's a different way of thinking. It's not about someone that doesn't actually know what they're talking about, just saying things for the sake of saying it. But it's important to try and get to that point where you can actually get yourself in the user or the customer's shoes, in my perspective, and go, well, that's not going to work. Why are we doing that? Share us a bit more about that experience.
Yeah, I think this is a place where it's worth kind of differentiating between UX and UI. And so originally what we were talking about, going and observing users, I think a lot of that is trying to figure out what are the requirements and what does the software need to do. And that's sort of fundamentally a UX task. And I think the mindset people need there is anthropology, not psychology. You need to go into these places like a cultural anthropologist and study what's going on and how people are moving in the space and in the environment and understand their work. And that, none of us are subject matter experts, or few of us are. So you need to go observe your user and that stuff. And that's user experience UX. But then there's UI. Like, does this interaction make sense? Does this dialogue box make sense? And that's more like reading somebody's essay and line editing it, saying the grammar's wrong, the punctuation's wrong, this sentence is confusing, you need to break this up, right? And that stuff is that's very learnable, but you have to understand UI, and you have to study UI, and you have to think about it for long periods of time, and then you develop a real intuition for it and a real strong sense of it. And I like to think that I have that, although it took me decades to get it. Clearly, Steve Jobs had it. One of the secret sauces of Apple that doesn't get any play outside the company is that up and down the executive food chain, they have incredible taste in user interface. Like, they just, all of them at every level of the executive chain, they know how to look at something and go, that doesn't make sense. They might not necessarily be able to tell you in the instant how to make it make sense, but they can tell you that doesn't make sense. You need to work on that a little bit more. And again, it's sort of like copy editors or line editors that are going through your book. And then the specific story you were asking about was, I did get to present to Steve 4 times, every one of them incredibly memorable. The particular story that I can tell you is we were showing him a new version of the Apple online store and the merchandising experience. And the page we were showing him was a redesign of the product details page. And on that product details page, there were some tabs down at the bottom, and there were tabs for like product, overview, product details, tech specs, and then ratings and reviews, something like that. And when he looked at the page, he just instantly said, "There's no way you're doing that to my effing store." And he said it much more emphatically than that, and honestly, these setups with Steve were very small audiences. It was me, the executive in charge of the online store, and Steve. So it's like three of us in a big conference room. Steve just looks at me. There's no way you're doing that to my store. And you're sort of like taken a little bit aback. And then he did what makes him Steve Jobs, which he didn't stop there. He then said, "Look, these ratings and reviews are really important to people. You can't hide them behind a click." And so when you think about that whole sequence, what he did is he very clearly and succinctly said what the problem was, and then he told me why it was a problem and what the user need was that we hadn't recognized and properly addressed. And it was highly actionable, super clear. And so I strive to do that with the feedback I give my team when we're at that point. There's other feedback sessions we have when we're trying to figure out the idea, and that's a lot more like throwing around ideas, and that's sort of like jazz improv. But then there comes a point when you're looking at the design and it's like, that doesn't make sense. What's the logic of that dialogue, of that radio buttons? Why are you using two radio buttons instead of one checkbox? What's the relationship between this state and that state over there? And that stuff is like super direct and on point, and you're trying to make it make sense. And I think actually there's very few people and companies that have the taste to judge user interface clearly. And I think that's a huge loss, and where frankly a lot of the issues in software comes from. It's just, and that's what's so frustrating to me, is because it's just general sloppiness, and you see it on steroids in enterprise software. It's just sloppiness, and it's not that the engineers or the PMs that were working on the feature, it's not that they didn't intend to do the best. It's just not their thing, and so I don't know. It's like reading a paper that was written by somebody who's not really a very good writer, and so the core of the idea might be cool, but it's just expressed in such a clumsy way that it doesn't make sense.
No, definitely. And I think that's a fascinating story, and I appreciate you sharing. I think it's important that that feedback is taken on and we learn from it, right? And it is with design. One thing I say is you're never going to get it right the first time around, as you say. Like, obviously, it's important that we do the best we can, and we obviously, you said earlier, if you've got ideas to kind of improve the design, take it away and do them and come back to me. But then it's great to have another set of eyes, another perspective on it as well, to say, okay, we need to refine this, we need to thrash it out. I think you spoke earlier as well, like at Apple, was around the idea of just discussing it, getting it to a point where it's like, okay, we don't have any more ideas of how we can make this any better, right? That's the point. And
yeah.
I guess that is a process of continuous improvement, right? Rather than thinking that, okay, we're just going to get this right on the first go. And I was talking to Martin Dahlman the other day about, this was more to do with the engineering side and all of that and the discovery of kind of projects. But I think the same applies, is that we know the least about something when we start, right?
Yeah, look, the chances of you getting it right on the first shot are absolutely zero. It's like zero. It's not going to happen. Zero. So the thing you have to do is you have to start drawing. You just have to get stuff out on the paper. And at Apple, and then I tried at Pinterest, and I succeeded at ThoughtSpot. We had reviews like every 48 hours. Like, designers, I would not let them go more than 2 days without showing work. And the reason was, I knew that there was always ways that we could make it better, and we would all make it better if we were looking at it all the time. And I also know that as a designer, if I let you sit there until you thought it was done, you're going to sit there forever. And what you mostly see people do is just sit there and get wound up with anxiety in their own head, thinking they have to solve it all on their own. And if I tell people, no, you have to show me something in another 2 days, they have no time to procrastinate and they have no time to stress. You just have to sit in your chair and start drawing. And then we'll look at it in 2 days and we'll make it better. And then we'll look at it another 2 days and we'll make it better. And then we'll look at it another 2 days and we'll make it better. We had work with like buy online, pick up in store, which eventually came down to two radio buttons in the cart. We went through 74 iterations to get to those two radio buttons, 74 versions to get there, and it took us a while, but it takes time. You're not going to get there in the first, second, third draft. Just, go look at novelists. I think Ernest Hemingway rewrote the opening paragraph to For Whom the Bell Tolls like 36 times. You keep going until it's right.
Continuous improvement. I totally agree. And not being prepared to kind of settle for the first iteration or the first version, right? Because it's never the best that you can possibly do, right? We've got to continually improve that. I'd love to get some of your thoughts on, we discussed earlier about UI, etc. From your perspective, what are some core principles, right? I know there's so many. There's endless topic essentially, but from your perspective, like, what are some key things that you have to do or have to get right in order for it to be a good UI or a good experience?
Wow, I'm trying to think of how to address that. So, look, I've got my little rules of thumb for when I'm doing UI design. Things like every list should have 5 or 7 items in it. You should never have more or less than that. It's because an odd numbered list can be visually parsed into 2 clear halves with one of the rows being a clear center. And so you can visually break it apart. I'm maniacal that the primary call to action button should never be disabled as a way to show that the user hasn't completed the state. So if you have a form that's got 3 required fields, the primary call to action should be available all the time. And then if the user clicks on it, then you can highlight which of the form fields need to be filled out. If you disable the button, there's no way for the user to be informed as to where the error exists. So I've got a handful of those kinds of rules that I kind of drilled into my team. I think maybe a methodology I could give you that might be more useful also kind of comes back to an Apple story. So, most every software team at a reasonably sized company now will have a set of design principles. And there's whole websites, that kind of aggregate these design principles. And the principles tend to be things like simplicity, clarity, security, privacy, stuff like that. And they're all kind of useful, but they're all kind of apple hood and mother pie, right? You would never argue the opposite of any of them. So they're not really useful as strategic statements. It's not like somebody's going to sit around and go, well, no, we should try to make it simple. And somebody else says, no, we shouldn't. We should make it complicated. Like that conversation's never going to happen. So saying needs to make it simple, it doesn't really mean anything, right? So again, at Apple, I had a chance to talk to Roger Rosner, who at the time was leading engineering for the team that worked on all the iWork apps, which included Keynote and Numbers and Pages and stuff. And when I was talking to him, he was telling me about when they started working on Keynote, because he had developed the first version of Keynote. And he said when they started working on Keynote, he went to Steve and he said, hey, Steve, how should we think about Keynote? And Steve said, look, in Keynote, you should focus on 3 things. 1, it should be difficult to make ugly presentations. 2, you should support cinematic quality transitions. And 3, you should optimize for innovation over PowerPoint compatibility. Now, each one of those 3 statements are clear, hard-edged tenets, what I'd call tenets, right? Like you could actually argue the opposite of every one of them. If I take that last one in particular, optimize for innovation, not PowerPoint compatibility. If Steve hadn't put that line in the sand, that team would have gouged each other's eyes out for the next 20 years, having that debate over and over again. And he said, nope, we're going that way, right? And I always thought that tenet concept was super, super powerful. And so when I got to ThoughtSpot, I wanted to create this design strategy that started from the very vision of the company and then came down and resulted in some tenets that we could rely on to build to make a whole host of design decisions. And so the vision of ThoughtSpot, data analytics company, the vision is a more fact-driven world, right? So that's the company exists to see that change in the world, a more fact-driven world. And then the mission is data analytics in the hands of tens of millions of users, right? So what the goal there is more fact-driven, or vision, more fact-driven world. Mission is getting software into the hands of millions of business users so they can make decisions themselves, directly accessing the data. And then from that, we derived a design strategy, which was the statement, encourage exploration and reward curiosity, right? We wanted people to be able to use the tool to get into the information space and freely navigate the metrics without encountering errors or encumberment, right? So then that speaks to all sorts of UI strategies. And so from that statement, encourage exploration and reward curiosity, we then derive 3 tenets. And one of the tenets was users should have to opt into complexity, right? If you really want to encourage exploration, you can't open the product and have like all this crap on the screen. You've kind of got to get it down to something simple, and then the user can turn on all these knobs and dials to expose panels and whatnot, and they can get to the power. But that tenet leads us to, a very strict philosophy of progressive disclosure, which is very different from what our competitors might do. So Tableau, Microsoft Power BI, they actually want to blow you away with power right from the very beginning. So when you open those products, it's like, boom, here's all, you can fly the space shuttle from this thing. And that works for their business strategy, but not for ours. So one of them was users should have to opt into complexity. The other one is end user documentation as a failure state, which is a little hard for my friends in documentation. But it was basically like, nobody should have to learn the software. Nobody wants to learn your software. Nobody wants to take the training. They want to read the manual. They don't want to click on the hover card. They don't want to go look up a question on Google. Like, nobody wants to learn the software. So the software needs to be as obvious as possible. It needs to, in fact, be sort of like a video game that you can learn by discovery and exploration. And then the last tenet we had is that the entire product should look and feel like it came from a single mind. And that tenet was how we really forced a discipline around adherence to the design system. So what we really tried to create on the design team was we wanted to make sure we had a really robust design system that accounted for all these different permutations. And then because we wanted the whole product to look like one unified whole, as though it came from a single mind, people had to follow the design system. We had a centralized design team. Everything flowed through one or two creative directors. That was the idea. So as my playbook as a design leader, if I was to go into a new company, I would go through that same sort of exercise and try to make sure that we got from the vision of the company, all the way down to what are the tenets of the UI, and made sure that we had a straight line there. So that we could use that as the basis for our design decisions, instead of it just sort of being willy-nilly day by day. We got to just get something out. This PM likes that designer likes that. So,
yeah, no, I think it's great advice. I think really, really good advice, and probably leads me into my final point, to just around the getting on the same page as the executives or leadership with the vision, right? From a design perspective, as in you've just touched off on it there, is so much from a product perspective. Not every company, but so many companies are just delivering things, doing things for the sake of doing them, right? Oh, we just do this. When you ask why, it's like, well, I don't know, right? Like, we're just doing it. We're just doing this. We're just doing that. And there's no real reason. There's no real impact behind it. But I love what you just said then, and the way you've laid it out is, but what's your advice? Like, how do you, from a design perspective, obviously you've talked about those tenets and everything, and getting the vision, but it's really important, would you say, for the design to be completely aligned with obviously the vision of the company and the leadership and executives and everyone to be on board?
Well, yeah, for sure you need alignment. I think a big weakness in what I see in design leadership today is that the mindset of most designers is service, right? Designers, they kind of fundamentally have this agency type model, and they kind of want to go to the client and say, well, what is it that you want? And I'll bring you options and you decide. And in certain types of companies, maybe that works. If leadership knows what they want, maybe that works. But in most startups, they don't really know. Like, the CEO's busy founding the company. Like, they have they just know design matters, and they've hired you to tell them. And so what I was able to do with ThoughtSpot is I spent time with the founder and CEO, and we had similar goals. We had a similar aesthetic. And so there was some sort of natural chemistry, creative chemistry between us. But I also realized that he needed me to make those decisions. Like, he hired me to lead. And it took me a while to kind of switch that mindset before I realized, when it comes to these, especially these UI decisions, like, I'm actually the best opinion in this company. So I should be making them. Like, he doesn't need me to bring him options and get him to decide. I occasionally had to do that because there was a strategic implication to the decision that would influence the business in ways that I wasn't comfortable being the final decision maker on. But most of the other decisions I had to make. And so this whole tenet and design strategy, all that sort of stuff, that wasn't me trying to collaborate with the executive team. That was me saying, this is what we think, this is what I think it should be. And generally speaking, they're like, yeah, that sounds good. In the same way that, like, the sales guy's not going to come to me and say, hey, Bob, what do you think about our new sales plan? Like, the salesperson is going to come up with the sales plan. The marketing person can come up with a marketing plan. Like, the design people have to come up with the design plan. And so I think part of this whole thing about design needs a seat at the table. It's like, well, if you want to, you kind of have to earn the seat at the table. They don't send you an invitation. You kind of got to have something to bring. And the thing you have to bring is your ideas and your passion and your vision. And I think you have to find some way of getting out of this service mentality and thinking that leadership's going to tell you what to do and you're going to respond to it. And that's, I don't know. I think that's an uncomfortable place for a lot of designers, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think it's an important, if you want to have real sustainable success, I guess, and really push forward. I think it's important. You should be, obviously you need to have the research or the evidence and the ideas, more importantly as well, but they need to be practical and actually aligned with where things are going. But if you do that and you do that work, you'll make headway, right?
Well, you have to make an argument. Yeah. I mean, it can't just be willy-nilly, I'm pulling this thing out of my butt. Like, you got to have some argument that's based on some firm foundation.
Yeah.
And that can come from lots of different places. But yeah, I mean, design's it's not art. You know, there has to be an argument that explains why you arrived at this solution. You know, and that was something that was really distilled in me at Apple. And that was part of what came out of having to do constant reviews with all the executives. You know, by the time we would get to Steve, which again was very infrequent, by the time we got there, though, I had a lot of confidence in the work we're going to show him because I could justify and explain our rationale on every pixel on the screen. Now, you know, in some instances, he may disagree with what we concluded, but he couldn't deny that we had thought it through. And most executives, that's what they want to know. Like, did you think it through?
100%. 100%, absolutely. And then what's the reason behind it? What did you think it through? Show me your thought process. Yeah, and it's fine to disagree, right? There's a million ways to do something, but if you're just doing it for the sake of doing it, then then you know it's really just trying to throw things at the wall and hoping something will stick. So
it's really like algebra class, man. You can't just show me the answer. You got to show me your work, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the conversation. I think it's been great. I've learned a lot, and it's been really insightful, and I appreciate you taking the time once again, and sharing all of your experience and advice. I do a finale segment where I ask a couple of questions,
sweet.
3 questions to each guest.
Okay,
so
here we go.
I'd like to jump into that now. Here we go. The first one is, what's one thing you believe businesses are not paying enough attention to right now that will be critical in the next 5 years?
This is going to sound insane, but I actually don't think they're thinking deeply enough about AI, and not just AI as they're going to manifest it in their product, but AI, how they could use it to make operational changes inside their company. So I think people are trying to fit AI into their existing model of computing, and AI is a completely different animal. It's not a new form of mammal. It's a completely new branch of it's a completely different thing. And so I think businesses are not, they haven't really updated their model yet.
Yeah, I agree. And it's going to have a bigger impact than I feel a lot of people realize. And it's only accelerating faster and faster. So I totally agree with you. The second one is, what legacy do you want to leave in your industry? How do you hope your work will influence or shape the future?
Well, hopefully it came through in some of my comments earlier. You know, I think software matters, and I care deeply about the digital built environment. And I want the digital built environment to be a place that's safe and inhabitable and enjoyable for human beings. That's not the digital built environment we have today. The digital built environment we have today looks like a slum with a bunch of advertising, and it needs to be better. So if I had any legacy, it's not even that I would necessarily directly have an impact on the digital built environment. I would like to think that I inspired a few people to think that they could go make a difference and that it mattered. And I think that's the main thing I think about these days. Yeah.
Okay, great. And the final one, I'm looking forward to this one, but if you could go back in time, what advice would you give to your younger self at the start of your career?
Oh, yeah. I asked this question on my podcast, but the other direction. So what would I tell my younger self? You know, I think I would tell myself that, strangely, I think I'd tell myself to be a lot more ambitious. You know, I think in my career, I was in a place that was expanding. I was in Silicon Valley. There was jobs kind of coming in, and I was sort of taking stuff as they showed up, but I never really got ambitious and said, what more could I be doing? And I think some of that was me, and some of that was just, again, kind of this designer's mindset. I think all of us know a lot more than we think we do, and we're all capable of contributing in much more interesting, useful, and valuable ways. So I guess, you know, at a meta level, I might say throughout most of my life, I thought that the people at the next level had it all figured out. And each time I got to the next level, I realized they were just making it up too. And so I wish people, you know, and that's not to say that they're not idiots or they're not well-informed or, you know, or whatnot. It's just, you know, there's uncertainty up and down the stack. and people get, people that are higher levels up, they're comfortable, they're more comfortable dealing with the uncertainty. And I think if I could tell myself anything, it's like, well, you should get comfortable dealing with the uncertainty and just embrace it more early on instead of, waiting for the adults to tell you what to do.
Yeah.
Get in the game. The world needs designers in the game. There's so many things we could be bringing to the table across social problems, government problems. Just the designer mindset, it could contribute to design as a problem solving methodology, could contribute in so many different ways to society in ways that go beyond haggling about typefaces and whatnot. As fun and important as that is, I just wish people could take our designer mindset and plant that on the tax code, or the healthcare system or public transportation or, stuff like that. Like we could just have that mindset could have a much, much bigger impact than most of us realize.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. And, appreciate the conversation. Appreciate you taking the time and sharing all your insights and your experience with us, and obviously the listeners as well. And for anyone listening, you can obviously check out Bob's work. If you go to LinkedIn or search his name, you'll find the information. We'll chuck some links as well around. And yeah, any other comments from you, Bob, before we close out?
No, hey, Julian, thanks so much for the opportunity for making time for me. It's great to be with you, and I hope the show is useful to your listeners. And I appreciate you out there, being out there and spreading the gospel about design and how it matters and stuff. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, it's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Bob.